this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Hey, what's up? It's Wanda Sykes. I'm here to remind you about something super important, getting your breast screened. Because trust me, your breast health should be a priority. Early detection for breast cancer can change the game, which is why you should visit yourattentionplease.com to learn more. And do me a favor, if you've already had a breast cancer screening, remind your friends and family to visit yourattentionplease.com too. We gotta look out for our girls.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa in this episode 1080 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm back from San Francisco. I'm back from Radio Row. The Super Bowl's over. Congrats to Seahawks fans. That means that we're officially in the offseason, though. Hopefully you guys like the change of pace of last week's shows, but we're full-blown back to the regular podcast schedule. Starting with this episode, which you already saw was sell candidates. I talked about some buy candidates last week. This is just the reverse. Players you might want to consider trading away from your dynasty teams. Sells are always more difficult than buys because we have fewer players to choose from. With buys, we can get deep. We can talk about bottom-of-the-barrel players who we can get for cheap. With sells, it doesn't make that much sense for me to say that you should sell someone who ranks as like the 200th overall player. In order for a player to be a sell, he's got to give you something decent in return. So to help me out with today's list, I looked at my dynasty rankings and I compared those rankings to Keep Trade Cut. It's not perfect, but that site at least allows me to get some baseline for market sentiment. If my rankings like a player far less than where he's ranked on Keep Trade Cut, I figured he's probably worthwhile to call out. Keep in mind though, I don't think these players are trade candidates no matter what. They're just players who I appear to be lower on versus consensus. In your individual league, that might not be the case. This is just a conversation starter, and it allows you to hear some logic that you might be able to apply to your teams and your own circumstances. Now, before we get to those sells, I just want to send another reminder that the 2026 version of the Late Round Prospect Guide, it's currently available for pre-order. This year's guide is bigger and better than ever, seriously. Not only have I revamped the models, but you're now going to get tight end profiles, not just tight end scores. Myself and Brandon Gadula have been working really hard on getting it all done. It's going to release in the middle of March. To learn more and get that discounted pre-order price, just head to lateround.com. One area where dynasty managers can really win big is not just knowing when to sell players high, but when to sell younger players high. Age is going to be part of the value equation for every player. The older a player is, the less valuable he is in dynasty. So if you can find a younger player who might have peaked or who might not see that much more of a value bump, and if you sell that player at the right time, it's massive for your dynasty teams. One of those players for me right now, this might be a little controversial, but it's Travion Henderson. As tough as it is to admit that. Henderson currently sits 30th overall over on Keep Trade Cut for Superflex leagues as the RB7. Now, admittedly, I can kind of understand why he's the RB7. Kind of. I do personally think that someone like James Cook makes more sense than Travion Henderson. But running back has a lot of volatility once you get to that range in Dynasty. It's really tough for me to back that kind of cost though, overall. Now, as many of you know, I have the year 2 model. That helps me figure out how well a player is going to perform after his rookie season in the league. It takes a player's prospect score, his ZAP score, some year 1 inputs, and then it spits out a score that helps forecast a player's year 2 through year 4. That changed year over year. I used to just look at years 2 and 3. I added year 4 this year to add some stability to that model. Travion Henderson's year 2 score is 73.9. Now that means nothing to people right now because I changed the scaling of the scores in the ZAP and year 2 models. But essentially, he's part of the weekly starter category, not the elite producer category. The elite producer category, that's where someone like Amari and Hampton sits right now. Weekly starters are solid, and to be fair, Henderson's on the upper range of it with his score. But they're more like RB2 types from a ceiling perspective than RB1s. To reiterate, the year 2 model looks at how well a player performs in years 2 through 4, and it measures that through their best 2 seasons average in PPR points per game during those 3 years. We do see some studs come from the weekly starter category, but 11% of them have a best 2 seasons average above 18 PPR points per game. 22% of them get to 16 PPR points per game. When you look at the elite producer category, those numbers go from 11% to 21% and then 22% to 32%. What might be more important here is the rate of getting to 14 or more PPR points per game. That's in the best 2 seasons average. It's 1/3 of the players in the weekly starter category. 1/3 of them average 14 or more PPR points per game in 2 of their 3 seasons. That number is 63% when looking at elite producers. Now, these are relatively arbitrary cutoffs that just help me explain the model. But Henderson's borderline between those 2 categories, and he fits more cleanly in the weekly starter category. That's where we see far fewer RB2s historically. I also look at his year 1 and I ask myself, where are things going from here, at least in the short term? I've let it be known that I think Ramondre Stevenson had a fantastic end of the season, but he wasn't very good up until December this past year. Considering what the Patriots just did though in getting to the Super Bowl, and considering the type of snap splits that we saw throughout the playoffs, I don't think Stevenson's going anywhere in 2026. The Patriots' potential out for Stevenson from a contract perspective, it exists in 2027, not 2026. And if Stevenson is there, we may just see a little bit more production, a little bit more volume from TreVeyon Henderson in 2026. Not a huge bump. And look, Stevenson ended up leading the league this past year in rushing yards over expected per rush. That's my general fear here. There's no doubt that TreVeyon Henderson has a weekly ceiling. We saw that this past year. He's very explosive. But will New England allow for that volume to exist in 2026? And what happens when the Patriots aren't winning? When they aren't facing as easy of a schedule? Because we generally see regression hit for teams like New England. Now, this has nothing to do with them having an overrated season. I think they were worthy of representing the AFC in the Super Bowl. It's just what we historically see. We see a little bit of a drop-off with a team like New England. And with Henderson not being the relied upon back and pass pro for them this year, and with Stevenson still there another year, I can argue that TreVeyon Henderson is much more of a sell than he is a buy, especially if you need that 2026 production. But like I said, I don't think he's necessarily overinflated within running back rankings, although I do think James Cook should be ahead of TreVeyon Henderson. There's just a lot of wide receivers that I like more. So if you want a more stable asset, I think trading away TreVeyon Henderson right now does at least make some sense. Let's stay with this theme of year 2 running backs. Let's look at RJ Harvey. I'm a few running back spots lower than consensus with RJ Harvey, and there's a few reasons for that. First, let's just look at him as a prospect. Now, I didn't mind Harvey coming out last year, but you can listen back to old shows where I mentioned that there's definitely a Harvey hive out there who likes him a lot more than I do. He was definitely explosive as a prospect, but he was an older prospect, and his metrics in the ZAP model, they were good, not great. They weren't elite. And now today, looking at the year 2 model, he's in the weekly starter bucket. His year 2 score is about 10 points lower than TreVeyon Henderson's, which does make sense when you compare their current value in the market. But there are some things that at the very least make RJ Harvey a little bit more volatile than the market might realize. Advanced metrics are not the end all at running back. I'll say that forever. They're less predictive than what we see at wide receiver. In fact, with the year 2 model, if you look at how a player performed in year 1 in PPR points per game, it's less predictive than a player's ZAP score when you're looking at year 2 to year 4 output. In other words, you're better off ignoring year 1 PPR points per game for running backs and focusing on how they looked coming into the league. But RJ Harvey's advanced numbers were really worrisome last year, or at least kind of worrisome. Harvey was 3rd worst among 48 qualified running backs last year in rushing yards over expected per attempt. He was 32nd in success rate when in that same offense, J.K. Dobbins was 12th. He was fine as a pass catcher with a 10% target share. He had a solid 1.36 yards per out run rate. And that's where we might see some fantasy juice from Harvey in the future. But his numbers overall, they weren't spectacular last year. I think the touchdown total from last season is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. People will point to his 12 touchdowns as reason to go in the other direction than this recommendation. But actually, we've seen rookie running backs bust in the past with double-digit touchdowns, or at least players who didn't go on to have some studly career. In recent memory, Phillip Lindsay, that was one back in 2018. But then there's Antonio Gibson, DeAndre Swift, who's been good but not excellent, James Robinson, Eddie Lacy, Alfred Morris. Those guys certainly weren't bad, but they make up like a quarter of the rookie running backs to hit 10 or more touchdowns since 2011. The year 2 model has what I call journey comparables, where the model finds historical comps for players who entered the league with a similar ZAP score and then finished year 1 with a similar year 2 score. They're players who went on a similar journey. They're not stylistic comps. They're simply score comps. RJ Harvey's top comparables right now are J.K. Dobbins, which is kind of funny, Zach Moss, and Amir Abdullah. Now, Kenneth Walker is pretty close, and David Montgomery, he's like 6th or 7th on the list. But there are a lot of questionable running backs on that journey comp list, and that scares me a little bit. I said it on the mailbag a couple of weeks ago, but the Broncos probably won't enter 2026 with RJ Harvey, Jaleel McLaughlin, and Tyler Bidet at running back. Maybe they just re-sign J.K. Dobbins, but we saw in 2025 how J.K. Dobbins very legitimately dug into Harvey's upside. Maybe Harvey in year 2 deserves more looks, and I think he will get more looks, but I'm going to anchor to the things that I know are predictive, and that's a solid ZAP score and a profile that's not being boosted by touchdown production. It's not like Sean Payton's a coach who loves bell cow running backs anyway. So to me, I don't mind Harvey. He may even be a redraft target for me this year. But I do question his cost in Dynasty right now.
This month, iHeartRadio is celebrating the stars of the 2026 Winter Games. Michigan natives Madison Chuck and Evan Bates are the undisputed leaders of American ice dance. As reigning world champions, they arrive in Milano Cortina with a reputation for storytelling and seamless chemistry that captivates judges and fans alike. After years of climbing the ranks, the duo is poised to cap their illustrious careers with the ultimate prize. They take the ice with one goal, bringing Olympic gold home. For more Winter Games gold, search Olympics on the iHeartRadio app.
Now here's a spoiler alert for today's list. I have a lot of year 2 players. It's just what the market is giving me right now. I don't hate these guys. I don't hate them as players, but if I think there's a little inflation going on, I'm not going to hold back, even if it might bite me at the end of the day. I at least want to share the logic. But here's the only guy on today's list who's not a year 2 player. Michael Wilson. Right now on Keep Trade Cut, Michael Wilson's listed right below Jordan Addison and Jalen Waddle and right above Jaden Higgins and Ricky Pearsall. And as much as I want to kind of be a contrarian and buy into Wilson, who I don't think is a bad player, I'm definitely more into those guys at those prices than Michael Wilson. Wilson averaged 21.2 PPR points per game from week 11 onward last year. The only wideout with more PPR points per game was Puka Nacua. Michael Wilson broke out. He showed everyone that he can handle a lot of looks in his offense. But that was also under some pretty specific circumstances. Marvin Harrison Jr. missed some time last year, and games where Harrison Jr. was active and played more than 50% of Arizona's snaps, Michael Wilson averaged 5.5 PPR points per game. If you want to filter that further and just look at games where Jacoby Brissett was under center, it's 7.5. Now, I don't doubt that Wilson's a better player than most of us thought entering 2025, where he went undrafted. But this ranking feels very selective. It feels like it's filled with recency bias. When you look at the greater sample, his season last year was good, not great. 20.4% target share, 1.59 yards per route run rate, a target on 20% of his routes run, 13 PPR points per game. Those numbers are fine, but they're not inspiring. And that was on an Arizona team, by the way, that ranked first in the NFL in pass rate over expected. They had more pass attempts at 649 than any other team. Chances are that passing volume is not going to stick year over year. If Wilson had more of a backbone before doing what he did during that stretch in 2025, I'd be more willing to buy into it. But with him being ranked around some really good young wide receivers, and with so much up in the air situationally in Arizona right now, I'd be willing to part ways with Michael Wilson at that listed price. Tyler Warren may seem like a crazy sell candidate because he objectively just had a pretty good rookie season. This is just a price thing though, and a tight end ranking thing. Most of my tight end ranks, they're pretty aligned with the market at the top. But I like Colston Loveland straight up more than Tyler Warren moving forward, and the market over on Keep Trade Cut does not. Let's just do a quick comparison of the two players. Warren did hit 11.3 PPR points per game in relevant games last year versus Loveland's 9.3. But he also finished with an 83% route share. Loveland was at 65%. Completely ignoring the playoffs where Loveland went nuts, Loveland hit a 70% route share in just 5 games last year. In those contests, he averaged 17.8 PPR points per game. Tyler Warren was at or above a 70% route share mark in every single game last year. And that's a talent signal for sure, which is why I think Warren deserves to be ranked relatively high in Dynasty. But quite literally, every single efficiency metric favors Colston Loveland. Yards per route run, 1.86, Warren, 1.63. Loveland showed that he can get down the field and not just be an easy outlet target. His ADOT was 4 yards higher. Loveland had just as many red zone touchdowns on 2/3 of the amount of red zone targets. Warren got him on volume, but that was largely due to the fact that the Bears didn't unleash Loveland until later in the season. So my point in bringing all of this up is that on Keep Trade Cut, Warren is listed ahead of Colston Loveland. I'm 100% on Team Loveland. And since that's the case, if I can get Loveland plus or even a swap, even if I don't love swapping players like that, I'm doing that all day long at this point. Don't forget too, Loveland's 2 years younger than Tyler Warren. It's honestly kind of shocking to me that Warren is ranked ahead of Colston Loveland right now. I think the discussion should be Warren versus Harold Fannin, not Warren versus Loveland. Next on the list is Travis Hunter. This one's a little bit more feel-based than anything else. But I'm also looking at where I have Hunter versus where the market does. And I'm like 6 or 7 wide receiver spots lower than what Keep Trade Cut is telling me. The ZAP model didn't like Hunter quite as much as other analysts did, though I did think he was a top tier wide receiver in last year's draft. That was largely driven by draft capital and the fact that he was just such an insanely difficult wide receiver to evaluate for so many reasons. I genuinely think that he was really about to catch on for Jacksonville before his injury this past season, which is really unfortunate. But that led to the Jags not only using Parker Washington more out of the slot, who ended up being a really good player, but they traded for Jacoby Myers too. And Myers, he got his deal with Jacksonville through at least 2027 the way that deal is structured. So you have Jacoby Myers, who we know is a great route runner, and he can command decent target shares. You have Parker Washington, who really established himself as a decent slot player, a really good slot player. And there's Brian Thomas, who had a disappointing season, but he's still a legit perimeter threat on his rookie deal. You combine all of that with the recent reports from ESPN that say that Travis Hunter could play cornerback with special offensive packages. That's a pretty bad sign. When a player like Jalen Waddle, who we know has at least wide receiver 2 potential in him, when he's ranked below Hunter as a 27-year-old wide receiver, I'd rather go in that direction. Or Jordan Addison. He's 24 years old, and he's been mostly fantasy relevant every year that he's been in the league. He's below Hunter on Keep Trade Cut right now. And Travis Hunter's year 2 comps, they're not pretty, you guys. Quentin Johnston, Henry Ruggs, Alshon Jeffrey, Tavon Austin, Jalen Reagor. It's a whole lot of first-round busts and semi-busts. Alshon's only on that list because the ZAP model really liked him when he came out. So I'd be fine with taking the L with Travis Hunter and trying to get some legitimate usable pieces for him right now. The final player today, it's another year 2 guy, Matthew Golden. Golden had a ton of analytical red flags entering the league, and he didn't walk away from his rookie season answering many of the questions that we had about him. He had a sub 12% target share, his yards per route run rate was a pretty mediocre 1.35, and he saw a target on just 16.5% of his routes run. Let's look at all players in the year 2 model database that goes back to 2011, all wideouts who ran at least 100 routes as a rookie and then had below a 1.5 yards per route run rate and below an 18% targets per route run rate. For what it's worth, both of those numbers are a good bit higher than where Matthew Golden was at this past year. That results in 95 wide receivers in the model's database. Of those 95, just 10 players were able to give us a season of 14 or more PPR points per game in either year 2, year 3, or year 4. And if you're curious, here are those players. DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, Sterling Shepard, Tyler Boyd, Will Fuller, Cortland Sutton, DJ Chark, Michael Pittman, Nico Collins, and George Pickens. When you hear that list and you look at that list, what stands out to me is that many of the players who sort of buck this trend are ones who profiled more as like a true alpha X receiver. The guys who didn't profile that way, they weren't necessarily elite throughout their career. They were solid, like a guy like Tyler Boyd, he had a solid career. But it's not like DeAndre Hopkins. And then there's the situation itself. Green Bay with Matt LaFleur is not the place that we generally feel warm and fuzzy about wide receivers. Yes, there's a chance that we see a different type of wide receiver room in 2026. But we've seen the Packers rotate their wideouts quite a bit over the last handful of years. And that's resulted in worse production. LaFleur got to Green Bay in 2019. From 2019 through 2025, the Packers have had 4 wide receiver seasons where the wideout finishes a top 24 player at the position in PPR points per game during relevant weeks. So removing the final week of the season. Davante Adams has 3 of those 4 seasons. The other one's Christian Watson, actually from 2025. He finishes the wide receiver 20 with 13.2 PPR points per game. And Golden's year 2 journey comparables, they don't make me feel a whole lot better about this. We're looking at Justin Hunter, KJ Hamler, Adonai Mitchell, and Zay Jones. Now, next in that list is Davante Adams. But Adams is also known as a huge outlier with how his career started and what he turned into. That is not something I want to bank on. So that's why, to me, Matthew Golden right now is kind of a decent sell candidate. So that's it. A ton of year 2 players and then Michael Wilson. Maybe I'm being too bold today. Or maybe the market really is just that optimistic with some of these players becoming big in fantasy football. I don't necessarily dislike some of the players on this list, especially someone like Travion Henderson. I'm just playing this based on the market. And I have other potential sell candidates too. You can check out where I have players ranked by heading to the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon, all found on lateround.com. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Make sure you're tuning into the Late Round Fantasy Football Show on Wednesday over on YouTube. That's at noon Eastern, but if you miss it, I'll drop it in this podcast feed on Thursday morning. And then this is a Perspectives week as well. So on Friday, I've got a brand new episode of Late Round Perspectives for you. I'll talk to you then.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.